My cousin called me the night before the board meeting to remind me I wasn't invited, not to ask how I was doing, not to catch up. He called specifically deliberately to make sure I knew my seat at the table didn't exist. Just so there's no awkwardness tomorrow, he said, his voice smooth the way expensive cologne tries to cover something rotten underneath. This is a family business conversation. The real family. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I set my phone face down on my desk, looked at the stack of files in front of me, and said one word into the receiver before I hung up. Okay. He thought that was surrender. He had no idea it was a starting gun. Have you ever been written out of something that was yours before you were old enough to fight for it? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. My name is Claire. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life I was the family's best-kept secret, the one they called when something needed fixing, but forgot to mention when something good was being divided up. My grandfather built Hartwell Building Supply from a single lumber yard in rural Ohio into a regional chain with 11 locations. He built it with his hands, his savings, and according to the story he told me every Sunday when I sat beside him at the kitchen table, with the help of the only grandchild who ever actually asked him how it worked. That was me, not my cousin Derek, me. I was 12 the first time my grandfather walked me through a balance sheet. I was 15 when he let me sit in on his meeting with the bank. I was 19, studying accounting on a partial scholarship, because my parents couldn't afford the full ride, when he pulled me aside at Thanksgiving and said, "Claire, when the time comes, I want you to be the one who keeps this honest." I nodded. I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I don't know. My grandfather passed 3 years ago. He left the business to the family trust, managed jointly until his youngest son, my uncle, decided the company needed new direction. That new direction had a name. Derek. My cousin Derek, who had spent the better part of his 20s backpacking through Southeast Asia on money borrowed from his father, who had never once balanced a checkbook, who referred to my grandfather's 11 locations as retail outlets like he was describing a mall kiosk, was being positioned as the future of Hartwell Building Supply. And I was being positioned as the past. It started small, the way these things always do. I wasn't included on the email chain announcing the strategic planning sessions. When I asked my uncle about it directly, he smiled the way people smile when they've already made a decision and don't want to explain it. "We're keeping it lean for now, Claire. You understand." I understood perfectly. Then my cousin started showing up to family dinners with a new confidence that hadn't been there before. He talked about restructuring the distribution model and pivoting the brand identity and unlocking latent equity. He used the words like weapons, throwing them fast enough that no one could ask what they actually meant. My aunt nodded. My uncle beamed. My own parents glanced at me across the table with the apologetic eyes of people who felt bad but not bad enough to say anything. "Derek has really come into his own," my mother said to me in the kitchen one night, handing me a dish to dry. "He's using words he learned from a podcast," I said. She laughed, then stopped herself. "Be nice, Claire." I was always the one being told to be nice. Then came the night of my grandfather's memorial dinner, 2 years after he passed. My uncle had organized it at the old house, the one with the big oak table where my grandfather used to spread out his ledgers. It was supposed to be a remembrance. It turned into an announcement. My uncle stood at the head of the table, where my grandfather used to sit, and told the assembled family that he had been working with the board to formalize a succession plan. Derek would be moving into a director of operations role immediately. There would be a formal vote at the next board meeting to restructure equity distribution within the trust. I set down my fork. "What does restructuring mean exactly?" I asked. The table went quiet. Derek looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for this moment and has already rehearsed his response. "It means moving forward," he said. "Grandpa's model was built for a different era. We need leadership that understands the modern landscape." "I understand the modern landscape," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm a CPA. I've been doing forensic accounting for 6 years. I've reviewed the trust documents. The restructuring you're describing would dilute the minority stakeholders, which includes my parents, by approximately 30%. Silence. My uncle cleared his throat. "This isn't the time or place." "You made it the time and place," I said. "You announced it at dinner." Derek laughed, short and dismissive. "Claire, no one is trying to cut you out. We're trying to modernize. Maybe if you spent less time with your spreadsheets and more time understanding vision." "Vision?" I repeated. "Yeah, vision. The ability to see where something could go instead of just where it's been." I looked at him for a long moment. The fake confidence, the borrowed vocabulary, the way he held his wine glass like a prop. "Okay," I said, and I picked my fork back up and finished my dinner. They thought I was backing down. What I was actually doing was memorizing everything. Here's what no one at that table knew about me, what Derek had never bothered to find out in 32 years of being my cousin, what my uncle had overlooked, because he'd spent so long looking at Derek that he'd forgotten to look at me. 3 months before that dinner, I had been contracted by an institutional investor named Caldwell Capital Partners to conduct an independent forensic audit of a regional building supply company they were considering acquiring. The company was Hartwell Building Supply. I know. Take a breath. I needed one too when I realized it. I had taken the engagement before I knew the target. The file came through my firm with the company name redacted standard practice in early stage acquisition review. By the time the NDA was signed and the name was revealed, I had already reviewed enough preliminary documentation to know two things. 1, this was my grandfather's company. 2, something in the financials was deeply, structurally wrong. I should have disclosed the conflict and recused myself. That's what the textbook says. But I had taken the engagement under my professional name Claire Reeves, my married name, different from the Hartwell family name, and Caldwell's team didn't know the connection. More importantly, neither did my uncle, neither did Derek. And what I had already seen in those preliminary files made recusal feel like walking away from a fire with people still inside. I requested a formal ethics review from my firm's senior partner. I disclosed the family relationship, presented the preliminary findings, and asked for a determination. The answer came back within 48 hours. Given that I was acting on behalf of an external party with no fiduciary relationship to the trust, and that the findings I had already documented suggested potential harm to minority stakeholders, including my own parents, I was permitted to continue under enhanced oversight. Every finding would be co-reviewed. Everything would be documented twice. I went back to work. The morning after my cousin's phone call, I drove to my office before sunrise. I made coffee. I opened the secure file portal, and I went looking for the shape of what I already suspected was there. Forensic accounting isn't about catching math errors. Anyone can find a math error. Forensic accounting is about finding the story that someone built to hide inside the numbers. Every fraud has a narrative. Your job is to read it backward. Derek's narrative started with the revenue figures. On paper, Hartwell's 3 newest locations all opened in the past 18 months, all championed by Derek as proof of his expansion vision, were performing remarkably well. Quarter-over-quarter growth of 22% in markets that the regional data said were flat. I looked at the top-line numbers the way you look at a painting you know is a forgery. Something technically correct about each brushstroke, but wrong in the aggregate. I started pulling vendor contracts. The expansion had been funded through an aggressive drawdown of the company's capital reserve, the same reserve my grandfather had spent 30 years building as a buffer against market downturns. That reserve had dropped from $2.4 million to just under $400,000 in under 2 years. The board had approved it. My uncle had signed off on it. They had been told the capital was being reinvested in inventory and infrastructure. I pulled the infrastructure invoices. 3 vendors: Precision Build Consulting, Lakefront Logistics Group, Meridian Supply Chain Partners. Combined billings, $1.1 million over 22 months. I ran them through the Secretary of State database. Precision Build Consulting, administratively dissolved 14 months ago. Lakefront Logistics Group, registered address, a mailbox rental facility in Indiana. Meridian Supply Chain Partners, no record found. I sat back in my chair. The capital reserve hadn't been reinvested. It had been extracted through fake vendor relationships, through shell companies, through invoices for services that were never rendered by entities that barely existed. I followed the payment routing. Precision Build Consulting's bank account was opened 9 months before it was dissolved. The account was linked to a holding LLC registered in Delaware. The registered agent for that LLC was a name I recognized immediately. My uncle's personal attorney. I pulled the LLC's operating agreement. There was one member listed, Derek. I printed the page and set it face up on my desk and looked at it for a very long time. He wasn't just mismanaging the company. He was systematically looting it. He had created the shell companies before he had even officially joined the operations team. He had set up the extraction mechanism before he gave the speech about vision and modern landscapes. He had planned this. Then I found the email. It was in a document cache that Caldwell's team had obtained through the due diligence data room routine business correspondence that Hartwell's management had submitted as part of the acquisition review. Derek had apparently forgotten, or hadn't thought carefully enough, about what was in that data room. The email was sent from his personal account to someone identified only by a first name. It was dated 4 months before the memorial dinner, before his grand announcement, before he called me the night before the board meeting to tell me I wasn't invited. It said, "Dad is almost ready to pull the trigger on the board vote." Once I have operational control locked in, the LLC cleanup takes 2 weeks. The old man's little accountant cousin is the only one who could ever read the books well enough to catch it, but she's in Chicago doing corporate audits for companies that actually matter. By the time anyone looks, I'll be 3 steps ahead. This thing is practically already mine. His grandfather's little accountant cousin. I read it twice. Then I picked up my coffee cup, took a slow sip, and felt something cold and very clear settle into place behind my sternum. He had thought about me. He had assessed the risk. He had decided I wasn't a threat. He was wrong about a lot of things. That was the one that was going to cost him everything. I compiled the report over the next 9 days. It was the most thorough document I had ever produced in my professional life. 112 pages, bank statements cross-referenced with vendor registrations, payment timelines mapped against LLC formation dates, the email, the routing numbers, a clear annotated chain showing exactly how $1.1 million in company funds had moved from Hartwell's Capital Reserve into accounts controlled by my cousin. I sent it to Caldwell Capital on a Thursday. They forwarded it to their legal team the same afternoon. By Friday morning, Caldwell's attorney had contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. By Friday afternoon, I received a call from my firm's senior partner. "Claire," he said, "the Hartwell matter has been escalated to law enforcement. I want you to know your documentation was airtight. This is exceptional work." "Thank you," I said. "How are you doing, given the personal connection?" I thought about my grandfather. The Sunday mornings. The ledgers spread across the kitchen table. The way he used to say, "Numbers don't lie, Claire. People do. Your job is to know the difference." "I'm okay," I said. "I'm really okay." The board meeting happened on a Tuesday. I drove 3 hours to attend it in person. My uncle had made sure my name wasn't on the agenda. He hadn't made sure I couldn't walk through the door. The conference room at Hartwell's corporate office was a room I had been in exactly once before, when I was 17 and my grandfather brought me in to show me the aerial photograph of all 11 locations hanging on the wall. It looked smaller than I remembered. The aerial photo was still there. Derek was already seated when I arrived, in a chair at the right of the head seat, positioned like someone who had already decided the meeting was a formality. He saw me walk in, and something shifted in his expression, not quite alarm, more like the first moment of a headache. A sense that something was about to go wrong without knowing yet what it was. "Claire," my uncle said, standing, "this meeting is for board members, and—" "I know," I said. "I'm not here as family." I set my credentials on the table, my firm's letterhead, the engagement letter from Caldwell Capital Partners, the 40-page executive summary of the full audit report. I'm here as the independent forensic auditor contracted to review Hartwell Building Supply on behalf of a potential acquirer. You'll find the summary in front of you. The complete report has already been submitted to the acquiring party and forwarded to federal investigators. The room didn't go quiet the way rooms do in movies, all at once like a switch. It went quiet the way air goes out of something gradual, and then suddenly total. My uncle picked up the summary, set it back down, picked it up again. Derek said, "This is a joke." "It's an audit," I said. "Page 7 has the shell company registrations. Page 19 has the payment routing. Page 43 has the email." He went still in a way I had never seen him go still before. Every performance of confidence, every borrowed word, every smirk, all of it dropped at once, like a costume falling off a hook. "You don't have access to my emails," he said, and his voice had changed completely. "Smaller, younger, the data room," I said. "You submitted it yourself, during due diligence." He looked at his father. My uncle looked at the summary in his hands. The board members around the table looked at each other with the particular expression of people who are doing rapid calculations about their own exposure. "Derek," my uncle said very quietly. "What did you do?" Derek didn't answer. He pushed back from the table, stood up, and walked toward the door. A man I hadn't noticed in the corner of the room, sitting very still in a dark jacket, also stood up. He was not alone. There was another one near the exit. "Mr. Hartwell," the man in the dark jacket said to Derek, "we'd like to speak with you." Derek stopped walking. My aunt, who had been sitting 2 seats down from me and had said nothing through any of this, put her face in her hands. My uncle asked me, in a voice I barely recognized, whether there was any way the report could be wrong. "No," I said, "there isn't." He nodded slowly. Outside the window, the parking lot was very bright in the afternoon sun. The legal proceedings took months. Derek was charged with wire fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. He eventually negotiated a plea. The sentencing was 14 months, plus full restitution. The shell companies were unwound. What could be recovered of the capital reserve was returned to the trust. The board voted to install an independent management committee to oversee operations during the transition. They asked me to serve as financial oversight advisor. I said yes. My uncle came to my office the week after Derek's plea was entered. He looked like a man who had aged considerably in a short amount of time. He sat across from me and didn't say anything for a while. I let the silence be what it was. Your grandfather used to say you were the only one who ever really listened, he finally said. I know, I said. He told me. I should have listened too. He looked at his hands. I was so certain Derek was the answer. I wanted him to be. It was easier to believe in him than to admit I didn't know what I was doing. I thought about the memorial dinner, the way the table had gone quiet when I asked my question, the way my uncle had said this isn't the time or place because the time and place had already been chosen and he hadn't chosen me. I know what that feels like, I said, wanting someone to be what you need them to be. He looked up. But numbers don't care what you need, I said. They just say what's true. Grandpa taught me that. He left without asking for forgiveness. I appreciated that. Forgiveness is something you give in your own time, on your own terms, not because someone needs it from you in a particular moment. I'm still working on mine. That's honest. The company is still standing. 11 locations. The Capital Reserve is being rebuilt. The aerial photograph still hangs in the conference room. I look at it sometimes when the oversight calls run long, and I need to remember what we're actually protecting. My parents received a formal acknowledgement from the board that their minority stake had been preserved in full. My mother called me when the letter arrived. She was crying a little. She said, Claire, I'm so sorry we didn't say anything at the dinner. I'm so sorry we just... Mom, I said, it's okay. We should have spoken up. You were the only one who... Mom, I said it gently. I handled it. That's what I do. She laughed through the crying. Your grandfather always said that. He said you were the one who handled things. I looked out my office window at the city and thought about a Sunday morning and a kitchen table and a ledger spread open between us, and an old man who believed in me before I knew there was anything to believe in. Yeah, I said. He told me. Last month, I went back to the old house, the one where my grandfather used to work at the kitchen table. My uncle sold it after everything fell apart. The new owners have painted it a different color. The oak table is gone. But there's a young family there now, 2 kids running in the front yard, and something about that felt like the right use of a place. I sat in my car for a few minutes and thought about what my grandfather built. Not just the company, the ethic. The idea that you show up, you do the work honestly, you don't cut corners, and you trust that boring and steady and true is worth more than flashy and loud and borrowed. He was right. He's still right. Derek thought stability was something to look down on. He thought steady was the same as stuck. He thought the person sitting quietly with the spreadsheets was the least dangerous person in the room. He thought a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to be in your corner, if you've ever been called too boring, too careful, too small to matter, I want you to hear this. The quiet ones are keeping the receipts. We always are. Subscribe to Karma's Turn. And I'll see you in the next one.